All right, hello and welcome to the podcast Eat Better Food Today. I'm your host, Ken Cunningham, and I'm excited to be sharing insights on why we believe that health and longevity begins with the food we eat. The goal of this podcast will be to inspire, educate, and enable folks to live a healthier life and do it affordably. My wife and I have been on this journey for over 10 years and continue to work on it every single day. Percentage of the profits from this podcast will be put towards child hunger with an initial focus on the poor suburb in America, East Cleveland, Ohio. As a reminder, please be sure to visit my website, Eat Better Food Today, for links to the show, videos, and all the recipes, books, and articles our guests provide. On this episode, we're grateful to have Nathan Rutz. Nathan is the Director of Soil for Rust Belt Riders. He's a graduate of Wabash College. I had to look up where it was from. Where he studied philosophy, chemistry, physics, and biology, and he's a certified compost operations manager licensed by the U.S. Composting Council, which I did not know existed until last week. On our previous episodes, we have talked a lot about the food we eat and its effect on our health and longevity, but the food we eat begins with the soil that it's grown in. So in this episode, we'll be exploring Nathan's thoughts on our soil and how it affects the food we eat. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you.
Before we get into the many questions that I do have, let's start with what you had for breakfast this morning.
I had a smoothie that my wife and 2-year-old put together while I was walking the dog, which involved frozen blueberries and strawberries and yogurt and cashews.
Very nice.
And a slice of rye sourdough that I make. I really like sourdough, and I really like the fact that we have Northeast Ohio Amish and non-Amish grown grains available through the stone mill at Stutzman Farms. And so I made a really rustic rye loaf recently that I'm really enjoying.
Oh, nice. You have to give me the recipe. My daughter's been trying to make sourdough in the starter and failed a couple of times. So
yeah, I think of it as being peasant food. So it's almost, I do use a recipe and I use a scale, but it's really pretty fail-safe in my experience.
Oh, nice. She did make one loaf that came out fantastic, but I haven't seen a second one. So I recently had a conversation with one of the listeners for this podcast and his mom, and she listens to my podcast with her 6-year-old son in the back seat, and he always asks the question. Ken never talks about what he has for breakfast. He always asks his guests. So I thought I'd share with Ziggy what I had for breakfast this morning, which is pretty much what I have every morning, except for at least during the week. So same thing, I have a healthy shake. I also have blueberries in there, but I had pumpkin seeds, walnuts, some macadamia milk without any additives, just macadamia milk, some olive oil, some whey protein, collagen, creatine, because I usually go to the gym and then have the shake, and then some honey because I need a little bit of sugar in there. I don't like putting sugar and stuff. So, and then on Saturday, Ziggy, when I cheat a little bit, there's a French bakery in Cleveland Heights that I get a pastry at. So it's kind of my Saturday cheat, pretty much every Saturday. So Nathan, I guess to kind of start here on your side, if you can provide a bit of background on Rust Belt Riders and Till Soil. I know Rust Belt Riders was founded first, and then Till kind of came second in the late 2017, 2019 era there.
Yeah. Rust Belt Riders started 10 years ago this year.
Okay.
As sort of a bizarre hobby of picking up food scraps by bicycle with the explicit intention of being as environmentally friendly and decentralized as possible. The earliest idea was that we were going to pick up food scraps. So this was 2014 when the USDA was handing out high tunnels like they were trick-or-treat candy. And so there were high tunnels going up all over the city. High tunnels are used for season extension. They're like greenhouses. They're the plastic greenhouses.
Gotcha.
Hoop house is another word for it. And so there are all these community gardens, the dreams, the unfortunately unrealized dreams of urban farming. And the idea was that we're going to bring food scraps, what is considered a waste to some people, and then bring it to somewhere where it can be a resource, which it actually is, to community gardens where it would be composted and then used to enrich the soil there. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough infrastructure, so this USDA was great. It was a good initiative, good idea, but it didn't have as much follow-up as I think it really needed in the end to keep those community farms going. And so we ended up having to then find other partners to take food scraps and make compost out of it, and then we learned to make compost ourselves. And then fast forward several years, now we're hauling, you kind of transition from counting as a composter in pounds to tons.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bit of a graduation. So we count things in tons these days, and we hauled about 3,200 tons of food ourselves last year, kept it out of the landfill.
It's a pretty significant graduation, by the way.
Yeah,
that's a lot.
Yeah. Although I will say, in Northeast Ohio alone, in a typical year, we landfill about 300,000 tons of food scraps. So we're really still just scratching the surface of keeping food scraps out of landfills and respecting the farmers and the land in that way. So we've come a long way. I'm really proud of what we've done so far, and there is a gigantic amount of slopportunity in diverting even more food scraps.
Did other organizations take advantage of that program, the USDA program we're talking about?
Oh yeah, I mean, so thinking about it, when you would drive around in 2014, 2015, there were hoop houses all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And then you saw them in tatters in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. And unfortunately, because there wasn't the follow-up. Some of them, I'm sure, are still up and being used.
Mm-hmm.
There's a small farm on Kinsman as you go from Cleveland to Shaker Heights on the north side of the street. They've got one that's been there for a long time. You see them in some places that are still growing in them.
So what...
Oh, I didn't tell you about tilth soil, though, really.
You didn't tell me about tilth soil. I was going to be,
the idea of tilth soil was that we're making a teeny tiny amount of compost, and we're never going to make a living on this tiny amount of compost. Can we make something else with this compost? So we got into potting soil for home gardeners and organic vegetable growers to start, because you can buy things in and make a larger volume of stuff. And it's pretty unusual to have a potting soil that has such a large component of compost, and compost offers a lot of benefits, which we can talk about right now, which are that it's nutrient dense, so it's made with all the food and leaves and wood chips that compose the initial mix of compost, and the composting process shrinks. And so if you're shrinking something, but a lot of the material, a lot of the elements are not volatilizing, aren't turning into gases, then you have a reduced volume, but the same amount of many of the nutrients, which means the concentration goes up. So you have an increased concentration of many nutrients. You immobilize your nitrogen in the bodies of microorganisms, meaning that unlike a conventional fertilizer, lawn fertilizer, let's say, when it rains, all that nitrogen typically is soluble and it can run right down into Lake Erie, where it does nobody any good. Whereas in compost, most of the nitrogen is in the body of microorganisms, and slowly over time they are eaten by predator microorganisms, and the nitrogen is released through the microscopic manure from the micro predators. And so there's a long, slow release of nitrogen that comes from compost versus from soluble fertilizers.
So explain that kind of, I had a question a little bit, but anyways, so I've done some research, and you talked about brown versus green, so kind of the carbon versus the nitrogen. Maybe explain that a little bit.
Yeah, brown and green are a reasonable way to think about it, though I tend to like to explain it a little more. It's more high carbon or high energy versus high protein.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you in that scheme, when it breaks down, is coffee grounds. Coffee grounds, what color are they?
Brown.
They're brown, but they're a green in that scheme.
Okay.
So it's really about what is the thing that you're composting. So microorganisms need a balanced diet like we do. If they eat just too much higher protein stuff, they stink, they smell funny, they don't feel good. It can be okay to go on a keto diet for some amount of time, but you probably shouldn't live your whole life on it, or generations of humanity on protein only.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens if you have too much protein in your compost feedstock. And if you only have carbs or energy carbons, then you're not going to be able to build a healthy, strong body. So you really need the combination of both,
mm-hmm.
and you need a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. That's the sciencey way of saying it. But in practicality, it's really by volume, typically about 2 parts high carbon, and that means leaves, wood chips, shredded paper, that sort of stuff,
mm-hmm.
and 1 part higher nitrogen material, which is higher protein material, which is really any food scrap. Where sometimes people think, oh, you can't compost meat, that's very high protein. And the reason you're often told not to compost very high protein things is because they require even more carbon.
Okay.
So you kind of need to dilute that high protein with more carbon if you're going to compost meat.
So you're getting so I guess from just a life cycle, so you're getting in food scraps now.
Yep.
you're bringing them into a facility, and then you're basically supplementing that with the carbon.
Correct.
To kind of make the compost.
Yep.
And then you're taking the compost and to get the till soil, adding other ingredients.
That's right.
And I'm more familiar with the till side because I go in and get bags of soil for different reasons. So that's kind of the life cycle of
that's
how
right.
this works.
Yeah, and one of the really cool things today is that one of our biggest customers is the Heinen's grocery store chain. Shout out to Heinen's for purchasing locally. So we pick up from all 18 stores, and their food scraps are beautiful. It's the stuff that you can't sell for various reasons, but it's beautiful stuff. They buy a lot of Northeast Ohio Amish grown produce, which is really cool because then we make compost with that food scraps, and we make Sprout, our seed starting mix, and we now have some Northeast Ohio Amish certified organic vegetable growers using both our compost and our seed starting mix. So we have a real life actual example of circularity happening.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So these farmers, are they selling at farmers markets, or where?
A few of them sell at farmers markets. Several of them sell into the Greenfield Farms Cooperative, who actually might be a really good podcast guest. And that's a vegetable cooperative that's based in Wayne County that picks up vegetables, certified organic vegetables that are grown on lots of Amish farms.
Oh, nice. That is a nice circular little piece of history there. So why do you think you guys have been successful? You kind of talked about the USDA program, a lot of hoop houses. Now there's not a lot, but you guys are still continuing to grow.
We've been willing to do things that other people don't want to do and make less money at it for longer than other people are willing to. Is the bottom line. So we're slowly growing into being able to be a more profitable business, which means that we can pay ourselves a little bit closer to a middle class income, and we've been willing to do hot, sloppy, stinky stuff when other people haven't, essentially. And we've been very bulldoggishly determined to do it. And we've got a great group of people, and I think part of the reason that we've been able to continue to exist is the way that we're organized. We're a worker-owned cooperative. So at our shop, we have 14 owners. People are eligible to become owners after 3,000 hours of work, and then a process of getting voted in, and then you're an equal partner.
Nice. So you kind of share.
Yep.
And that's kind of nice.
Yeah, so it really, in my opinion, has helped us maintain an entrepreneurial spirit broadly. There's not like one person that's like the visionary of this company. We have lots of people that really take ownership of projects and want to go in directions and are highly motivated. And so similarly, we've never had any issue hiring. We've never had a shortage of people that want to do meaningful work in a truly more democratic workplace. Because, we ostensibly live in a democracy, but work is often an autocracy. So why can't we practice democracy at work? So we think we can.
Yeah, and there are employee-owned companies out there.
That's right.
They're not a lot, but they're out there.
Yeah.
So interesting. My daughter works for an engineering company, and they are an employee-owned company. So she's
very nice.
Pretty happy there. So last month there was a partnership announced with the city of Cleveland. Can you explain a little bit about what that's about?
Yes. So this was the work of my colleague Zoe Appisdorf mostly, and Robert Kurtz, and Dan Brown. And if I'm forgetting anybody else at Rust Belt and you're listening to this, my apologies. Working with the city for many years, and we are working with them through this USDA grant, and Riddle, who is another very important partner, also should be on this show, we're giving access for food scrap drop-off to more people in the city at zero cost to user. So a lot of time we're talking about things that have invisible costs. So trash service is an invisible cost service. Everybody knows it costs money to have trash picked up, or maybe you don't, but it takes money to pick up your trash. You're paying for it in your water bill, but it's an invisible cost because you kind of forget that it exists. Whereas right now our food scrap drop-off does cost money. And so what we're working on, particularly in lower income zip codes, is to provide the opportunity for folks to opt in to dropping off their food scraps into our compost stream instead of to the landfill. We're also working with Riddle to train more folks in making their own high quality compost. And part of that grant also involves money to be available to urban gardeners for the purchase of quality compost.
So where the money's coming from the USDA, is that?
Yep.
Okay. And then you're leaving kind of like you'd have a regular trash can, a recycled trash can. You're going to have some other method for you to pick up the...
So, yeah, great question. So we have two methods of collecting residential food scraps. The more expensive version, which we would be picking up from your doorstep. We do that in a few locations around town, a 5-gallon bucket. The less cost option, which is very popular, is where we have 30 locations currently around Cuyahoga County where there are locked bins that members get the code to, and they can drop off food scraps at those locations at their convenience. So what this grant is allowing us to do is footing the upfront cost of putting out 10 new drop-off locations in the city of Cleveland, so that it will be accessible to more people. And then in an ongoing way, it's the lower cost option until the day we have enough public education to do like a 3-bin system. I mean, even in Seattle, there's still a lot of contamination, and they've had a 3-bin system for years. So there's a lot of work to do, which is why we're starting. And I appreciate this because it's also that we approach that the city of Cleveland. Shout out to Ren Brumfeld for bringing back recycling in the city of Cleveland, because it's an opt-in system now, so that instead of everybody getting a recycling bin and having horrifically contaminated recycling because of the challenges of educating everybody about what is and isn't recyclable as you change recycling contractors, now it's just the people that are highly motivated to do it who are going to pay attention and have a clean stream. Yes, it's not as much material on paper, but if it's actually getting recycled instead of landfilled, that's a win.
So I've got 2 questions based on that. So one, explain what happens to food scraps that go in a landfill. I know what happens when you collect them and turn them into something good, but what's the downside of going into a landfill?
So the first thing to say is that about 40% of all the food grown in the United States is never eaten. That includes, that's not all of that is landfilled.
Did you say 40?
40.
Wow.
So that includes food that's left in the field and is never harvested because maybe it doesn't look quite right. So there's a huge set proportion that is landfilled. I believe the number is about 20% that is landfilled of the total food. So when it goes to a landfill, it gets buried. And when it gets buried in humongous landfills that take thousands of tons a day in many cases of material, it gets smushed down by giant steel-wheeled monster trucks, basically, that drive over the landfill cell. And that smushes it down, and then it gets covered daily. Then over time, life finds a way. Microorganisms start eating the stuff. But in those conditions, because it's so smushed, there's no oxygen. And so the microbes that can survive in those conditions are called anaerobic versus aerobic. Aerobic organisms, such as ourselves, most of the time, are breathing oxygen. Anaerobic organisms, metabolism doesn't use oxygen. It's less efficient overall, but it does. Many anaerobic organisms can make methane as a result of their respiration, basically of their eating and digestion of food material in a landfill. They're making methane. So when they're essentially farting out methane, there's billions and billions of these microbes, it comes to the surface of landfills. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, quite a bit more potent than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, where it contributes to our global climate change problems today, and we'd really like to avoid that. The second indignity of food scraps in a landfill is that food came from land. That food came from a farm somewhere. That food is made out of air, water, and rocks, as is our bodies. And the rocks that compose the solid portion, the non-carbon-based solid portion of food, is now buried forever. And it was in a proportion to be a delicious beet or orange or something, and now it's trapped in a landfill forever. So we're stripping our farmland and burying it in an inaccessible place in a landfill. So you have the problem of the anaerobic digestion in a landfill is very inefficient. There's lots of leaks. Yes, there is some landfill gas that is tapped and captured and cleaned and put into the gas pipelines. That is better than not doing that, but it's still not a great thing at all. And you have the fact that we're depleting our farm fields and not returning those nutrients that came from those farm fields to any land at all.
Got it. So how back to the education piece. So when my kids were little, they're much older now, but when they were little, elementary school, they went to a Catholic school in Cleveland Heights and St. Anne's. And when they were in school, they basically were educated kind of on what you're talking about, what to do with food scraps, what to do with cardboard, all that kind of stuff. And they educated me. I didn't know
Great way to
anything
do
about
it.
So what is your organization doing anything from an education for children, I guess, is a question.
We are working with quite a few and growing number of schools so that kids can experience diverting food scraps at school and then bring it home.
Nice.
Yeah, Robert Kurtz, who does our commercial sales accounts, does an amazing job speaking at schools. Yeah, and kids love the opportunity to separate these things, and they really get it because it's sort of intuitively obvious until you're trained out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are some chefs that we've had in the show. Ben Beaven Roth, I know he's doing stuff with City Cleveland schools. Bob Gorman, he'll actually get his show will get released next week, but they're doing a lot of fresh vegetables for kids. So
excellent.
Kind of like a nice, again, that whole life cycle thing for kids in school. They're kind of learning about everything, so that's good from a produce, vegetable kind of life cycle standpoint. So
absolutely.
So nice. So who are some of your other customers? We kind of talked about the homeowners. We talked about the city of Cleveland. Who are some of your other customers?
In terms of food scrap hauling?
No. As far as the end product. So kind of
sure.
Go through the cycle and goes to.
So there's a number of small farms in Ohio and regionally, vegetable farms primarily, that use our compost and our sprout seed starting mix. We also work with legal licensed medical cannabis growers.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of them in the state of Ohio that Galenas and Pharmaceutical RX grow in our Bloom mix, which we developed with Galenas over several iterations to be an organic approved potting soil for cannabis growing. And now that issue 2 passed, people can grow it at home using Bloom as well.
Oh, okay. And what, from your geographic reach, I mean, what customer-wise, are you just Northeast Ohio, or are you broader than that?
Yeah, we'll ship to basically anybody that wants to pay for LTL freight, but we really like to think of ourselves as serving Ohio and the surrounding states
Mm-hmm.
with high-quality potting soil. And then for compost, it's really just northern Ohio, ideally, because compost is heavy
Mm-hmm.
and trucking compost is expensive. So for potting soil, we do have customers as far away as Florida, Texas, and Washington State, but we really think of ourselves as Ohio and the surrounding states as being our hometown.
Nice. So when I was listening to that podcast I mentioned to you before the show, so you came up with this bathtub analogy, which I thought was fascinating. So maybe if you could explain that for our listeners.
Yeah, I don't remember who I heard the bathtub analogy from first, so I give credit where it's due, but I think it was from Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems, where the idea is we're talking about carbon in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of carbon in the atmosphere as a bathtub, everybody's experienced a bathtub, and there are some things put carbon into the atmosphere. We can name them. Burning fossil fuels is a big one. Landfill emissions are another one. There's lots and lots of them. So one of the important things to do if we're going to prevent the worst impacts of climate change is reduce the amount of flow of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which means turning down the faucet. We're always going to have some water going into the tub out of the faucet. That's normal. We live on a planet that has stocks and flows of different elements that are necessary for life. And if we turned off the flow completely, that wouldn't be a good thing. We need some carbon dioxide always moving. But if we have too much in the bathtub and we don't have anywhere for that CO2 to go or that carbon in the atmosphere to go, even if we would transition to renewables overnight, that trickle of CO2 is still going to overflow the bathtub if we don't have a drain. And the biggest drain, the most appropriate drain, in my opinion, is farmland. So soil carbon has been depleted. There's a book by a guy named David Montgomery, who's a storytelling geologist, called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. And it documents, in a more accessible form than scientific literature, stories of civilizations that essentially plowed themselves out of existence. such as the Roman Empire when they desertified the Fertile Crescent by mold boar plowing excessively to grow wheat, and ad nauseum through history. So if you expose soil to oxygen and sunlight, the carbon in the soil, which is where the microbes live, which holds water, gets oxidized because it's now exposed. The surface area is greatly increased and it's exposed to air, and aerobic bacteria can then eat the stuff, and then when they eat it, they respire, they breathe out, just like us, CO2, and it goes into the atmosphere. Meanwhile, over time, depending on your farming techniques, if they involve minimal tillage, minimal disturbance, adding organic matter, keeping as much green plant cover on the ground at all times as you can build up soil organic matter. So soil organic matter can store carbon. Trees, plants, all of our food are made out of air, water, and rocks. So the carbon, the structure that makes wood tough, that amazing molecule is literally made out of air because it's a carbon-based molecule. All carbon-based molecules are made out of air. So you can think of plants as fixing nitrogen. They're taking this gaseous stuff and making it solid. And then the plant can use that, can be its body as wood or cellulose for stalks of non-woody plants. And then some of that photosynthate, as it's called, as sugar, gets squirted out of the roots of the plants into the soil to feed soil microbes. And a portion of that carbon as soil microbial bodies ends up being what's called recalcitrant, or it gets kind of stuck because of the complex geography of subsurface soil. So then there's carbon that sticks around, flowing a little bit in the soil, but you can build up the amount of carbon in the soil, and that carbon sticks around. And so a really healthy soil around Ohio, and it's different based on different soil types, but for most of Ohio, about 5% organic matter is a really nice high organic matter. But a lot of farm fields are down to 1% and less soil organic matter. And if you're thinking about the weight, I'm going to get this wrong, but I believe the way soil scientists think about this is about a 6-inch deep slice across an entire acre, weighs about 2 million pounds. And if you're taking, maybe it's 2 million, yeah, that's my units might be off. But if you're thinking about 1% to 5% of that huge volume, and then you go any deeper than 6 inches even, that is a gigantic amount of carbon that can be stored in soil and ought to be stored in soil that was in soil previously. So as we're burning up dinosaurs from eons ago and sticking that ancient sunlight, because that was carbon from the atmosphere that got made into plant, that was then plants grew and then either stayed as plants or was eaten by animals and then got smushed over geologic time. That is ancient atmosphere that we are now sticking back in the atmosphere. And meanwhile, we've depleted the soil organic matter on our farm fields, and by better farming practices with cover cropping, reduced tillage, application of composts, etc., we can increase that soil organic matter and stash carbon out of the atmosphere where we've got too much. We're almost going to overflow this bathtub. So we're trying to open the drain of the bathtub, because right now the bathtub drain is clogged because there's not enough carbon draining out of the carbon bathtub, and there's too much going in. And so, if the carbon bathtub overflows, that's catastrophic climate change results. So we want to avoid that. So we really need to both reduce the input into the tub, decrease our use of fossil fuels, etc., and increase the size of the drain, which means changing our farming practices, among other things.
Yeah, and it seems like here, meaning the U.S. versus, let's say, Europe, they seem to have better farming practices over there. Less chemicals, better soil, better products, quite honestly, as far as what they're growing. So
I would say one of the areas that gives me the most hope in this challenging time of ours is the amount of voluntary adoption of more regenerative practices by broad-scale farmers. You hear about it. If you look in the right places, you can hear about it all the time, and that there are tens of thousands of acres transitioning to better practices yearly. So that's one of the things, and this is a thing that I think is really interesting because we have such political gridlock, but everybody knows that soil carbon is something that we want for our farming. So soil carbon is a win across the board. And if we can have policies that promote increased soil carbon that are palatable to whatever state that you're in, let's do it.
So how does that improve, so the 1% versus 5%, how does that improve the food everybody's eating? You talked about some of your customers are organic farmers and they're kind of part of that whole life cycle, so then they're going to grow organic fruits and vegetables. So why is it better?
A healthier plant means it's healthier food. So if the plant is doing better, has more access to complete nutrition for itself, then you, the eater of that food, have more access to complete nutrition for yourself.
What about all the weeds that we use fertilizer to kill all the weeds while we're growing soybeans, corn, wheat, whatever the product might be?
Well, one thing to point out is that corn and soybeans are mostly grown in the U.S. are mostly not eaten by people. They're mostly either used as industrial feedstocks to make corn juice, aka high fructose corn syrup, which isn't good for anybody.
That's correct.
Ethanol, which has a terrible energy return on investment, or feed for animals in confined feeding operations, which are no fun for the people that work there or the animals that have horrible lives there, etc. So, healthier soil makes healthier crops. Why does healthier soil make healthier crops? One reason is that if you think about the way a plant eats, so if you're a plant and you're completely dependent on soluble fertilizers given to you by someone, by a person, by a human, rather than being able to live your life processes and get stuff yourself, the plant is more likely to be more like an IV patient than a vigorous, healthy person. So the way that plants don't have teeth, they don't have stomachs, and yet they need zinc, calcium, magnesium, all those minerals. And minerals come from rocks. So the body of
so you're saying, you keep saying rocks. You're talking
literally
about
rocks.
Literally rocks. Okay.
Literally rocks.
Okay.
And so soil is sand, silt, and clay, which refers to basically sizes of rocks. So when you pick up a clod of soil, there's sand, silt, and clay there typically, and the sand is the biggest, clay is the smallest, silt's in the middle, and they're just very small rocks that are in a matrix together, and about 1 to 5% of that is going to be organic matter, which is the living, the dead, the very dead, and the very, very dead, formerly living things. So that's where literally, if the calcium that's in our bones comes from soil, and so if a plant needs to get that, the plant doesn't have a mouth, the plant doesn't have a stomach. How does the plant get calcium?
Roots.
How?
Well, water. I mean, I don't
yeah,
know.
right. Yeah. So that's where I'm getting is that So the reason a healthier plant is better able is because a healthier plant is able to photosynthesize more efficiently. If a plant can photosynthesize more efficiently, it's able to make more sugar. If it can make more sugar, that means it has enough sugar for itself, because plants are autotrophs, meaning they make their own food. So they're eating a portion of that sugar. They're also, again, leaking sugar out of their roots and feeding microorganisms. And it's the bacteria and fungi that make the acids and enzymes that are necessary for mining. The gentlest in situ mining operations on the planet are run by bacteria and fungi in the soil around the roots of plants. So the bacteria and fungi are pulling calcium, etc., out of the sand, silt, and clay, the mineral matrix of the soil, and it's in their bodies. And then they get eaten by microorganisms like protozoa and nematodes, and the microbial manure right there in the root zone contains some of those mineral nutrients. There's also mycorrhizal fungi, which is a relationship where plants and fungi, the fungi literally grows into the plant roots, and the plants trade directly sugar for water and minerals that the fungi can pull throughout the soil profile in ways that the plant isn't able to, because the plant doesn't need to, because it knows how to partner with the microbes that ought to be there, that it expects to find over evolutionary time.
So this may be a stretch, and you can tell me I'm all wet here, but so there's been a lot of so you're kind of talking about microbes having more organic matter in the soil, that's healthier for the plants, so therefore it's healthier for the food that comes off the plants. There's also been a lot of research done recently on microbes in us, as in our gut, and how it makes a healthier individual, more brain health, longer life, less, chronic disease, et cetera, et cetera. So is there a connection between those two?
Absolutely, there's a connection between those two. Yep.
So
would you want me to elaborate on it?
Yes, please.
Yeah. When you eat fruits and vegetables, you're getting some complement of microorganisms on those things. It's probably healthy in some contexts, to have some dirt on your food when you eat it. The microbes in our guts are very similar to microbes that are in the soil food web. So yeah, we're absolutely come from Earth, and those similar microbes are in our guts as are in soil.
So it's kind of
in us and on us.
Yes. So it's kind of, I'm trying to, because my next question then gets kind of in ultra processed foods. So and there's been this is a study I mentioned to you earlier. So is this British Medical Journal, BMJ, ultra processed foods, adverse health effects for people that eat a lot of them. It's not saying you should never have a potato chip. That's not what we're saying here. But the fact that up to 60% of the American diet is ultra processed foods, that's not anything we're talking about here. That doesn't have healthy microbes.
Right.
It doesn't have
a balance of nutrients.
Right. Versus in Italy, where you hear a lot of the blue zone conversations, they live to be 100, they eat 10% of their diet's ultra processed food. So there seems to be a connection between healthier eating and living longer is kind of what I'm trying
Absolutely.
to draw here.
I think that's fact. But exactly how and exactly what situations and exactly what type of microbes, we're just at the beginning of understanding those things. As the price of DNA testing comes down, we haven't had any DNA testing done on our compost. I can't tell you what exact microbe, and we probably, because they're consortia, they're like thousands of types of microbes that work together in certain contexts. It's very complicated stuff, but in general, healthier plants have healthier microbiomes, which helps us have healthier microbiomes too.
Fantastic. And again, I think that's like we were talking about earlier, just an education of kids. We're trying to do this project in East Cleveland here, to get kids to basically understand the composting, how that works. Same thing with the foods they're eating, kind of the differences between the different foods and kind of how that affects. Because a lot of what I learned, and a lot of people I've had in the show learned about healthy eating, came from parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. So people need to be educated, which is what we talk a lot about on this podcast.
Yeah,
so.
Eating delicious food that is healthy really helps.
Yes, and it tastes better.
Yeah.
All right, so home composters. This is kind of a little bit of difference. So I used to have a home. My wife and our kids are older, so we moved into a condo. I don't have a place to compost in the backyard anymore. So I bought this little home composter. I take all of my vegetables, instead of filling up my trash with compost, I now put it in there. It kind of, air dries it.
Oh, okay, got it.
Takes all the water out.
Sure.
And I just end up with a pile of what looks like dirt. So
yes, so those things, I think they are improperly called composters. They're not composters, but they're not a bad thing. They just aren't composters.
Okay.
So they're grinding and dehydrating food scraps.
Yes.
And then that material doesn't take up very much room. It's very stable. It doesn't smell like anything. You could keep a lot of it around, but it does then need to be composted.
Okay.
We can take those kinds of materials, but those things are they're not making compost because it's not microbially degraded. It's a physical drying process.
So what do you need to do with that to make it?
Yeah, you could. I mean, if you wanted to, you could put it in a compost pile. If you have a friend with a compost pile, you need to add a lot. Remember when I was talking about how meat has a lot of protein in it? The dry food grounds has a lot of protein in it because it's shrunk. So that stuff then can be added to a regular compost pile and then turned back into compost. You could use a little bit as sort of like a top dress fertilizer on some plants, but my understanding from talking to some of the manufacturers of these devices is that most of the time the dry food grounds are fairly high in salts, and so salt-sensitive crops like lettuces would be unhappy with a large application of this stuff.
So I'm learning as well through some of these conversations. So I basically collected a whole bucket full of this stuff last winter, put it in my community garden, and it did not yield any positive benefits to my garden last year.
Gotcha.
So,
and I would expect that to be the case because it was not composted and it may be fairly high salt.
okay. So this year I bought a lot of bags of Wendell, put it on top of what I put down last year, and hopefully I'll get better results this year.
Yeah, and if some of the dry food ground is still around, the microbes will eat it.
Okay, cool. All right. So how do we, I mean, education we've talked a lot about, but how do we get people eating healthier? I guess, I mean, everything you've talked about, and
well, I think there's there's an infinite number of ways to do it, but it seems to me that making healthier food more accessible is really important.
mm-hmm.
The reason lots of people eat ultra-processed food is convenience and price. And I would say there's honestly a pretty serious failure of the organic movement and slow food movement of really taking any bite out of the crime of big agribusiness. You know, we've had slow food since the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and it's maybe 1% of the food market. And so it's not easy to get good stuff. I mean, for a while, Chipotle was talking about their sourcing. I haven't seen that at Chipotle stores anymore. I don't know if they've de-emphasized it or changed their sourcing, but that was the only fast casual, mass market food place that was really talking about, that I saw, at least in my world, talking about where food comes from and intentionally trying to choose better sources. So I think there's a lot to be said about the inaccessibility and sort of elitishness of some of the slow food movement, though there have been absolutely earnest attempts at making it more democratized, but it has not worked.
Yeah, I've had some other opinions that agree on that too. So how do we so I mean, we'll talk about this in a couple more questions here as far as a recipe goes, but how do we encourage people to do more healthy meals? I mean, that's why I've had chefs on the show, because when they talk about food, you want to eat what they're talking about.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, it smells good in the kitchen, it tastes better. I mean, how do you get, and you can do it in a relatively short period of time. So, I mean, fast food, you still got to drive the car, you still got to wait in line, because every time I see a line, there's like 2 dozen cars, and it's not, I don't know, it's not as fast as...
Yeah. The thing that is happening a little bit in my life that I'm attempting to, my wife and I are attempting to get into more of, is sharing the load of food preparation.
Mm-hmm.
And so getting together with friends or rotating who's going to make dinner for that night. Because I love cooking, but I don't want to make dinner every night. So how can we work together with friends and family and not be so, we can also like hang out with people and not have to do all the work all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a social element to that I think is healthy, very healthy, physically and mentally, in sharing things in a way that I think is a challenge. But that's something that in our personal lives, we're really focused on, is how do we share time so that we don't have to do all the work, so that everybody's not doing work in duplicate. Because right now everybody has to almost everybody has to figure out what they're going to eat that day for themselves.
Right.
When, you know, if you had a food club on the block that 3 nights a week made group meals, that could be pretty darn cool.
It's a good idea. It's a very good idea. So, okay. Yeah, so getting people together, and I think part of the longevity conversation we have on this show, I mean, food's important, exercise important, sleep, community's kind of the fourth pillar there. If you don't have relationships, so part of what we've talked about is don't sit at home with your video games all the time. Watch. I mean, get out, do something, talk to friends,
right.
Make a meal. That's a great idea too. I mean,
yeah, and I guess another thing is there are. I think we tend to think of food, free meals at churches as being for the very poor, but if we made them actually community meals where people of mixed incomes showed up, that'd be really powerful.
It's a good idea. It's a very good idea. I could make that part of the East Cleveland movement. So, if you had the attention of the world for 5 minutes, what would you say if you could get on your soapbox?
We live in a world of systems. Everything is interconnected, that there is no straightforward causality. That if we're going to get out of the mess that we're in, we have to think about sometimes counterintuitive approaches and consideration of unintended consequences. We have to be very wary of solving problems in boxes without being cautious about things that we do not intend to happen as a result of those well-intentioned actions. So I think that the knowledge that linear causality is a myth is central. Thinking about, we live in a causality is intertwined and circular, and thinking about the webs of influence is critical to making better choices. I think a focus on what is our culture, because I think a lot of the way that our economy behaves drives toward homogeneity and loss of identity. So McDonald's and Starbucks and Chipotle are the same across the country. And when those places open and other local places close, we lose some identity. And I think that somebody might push back on this, but all the best cuisine comes from peasants living on land over a long time and figuring out what tastes good and grows in their region. And so all the amazing flavors, and sometimes there's imports from across the seas of plants that grow well. What would Italy be without tomatoes? For example, but it's people that live on land in communion with land and others that develop the most delicious and healthy foods. And we don't have that now. And I don't exactly know how to fix it, but I think it's clearly a systemic issue. I think, if we could have an economy that serves people and the planet instead of people and the planet serving the economy, that would be a really good way to go. Thinking about a well-being economy rather than a GDP growth economy is something that I would like to see.
Well, and I think if people ate healthier, I've had a couple of doctors on the show talking about diabetes and functional medicine and such, but our healthcare costs would go down. If people ate healthier, everybody wouldn't have to go to the doctor for all these chronic diseases, or they'd have to go less. So that would be huge. We're talking billions of dollars in savings here.
Absolutely. Can we have a healthcare system instead of a sick care system?
Yeah, exactly.
Can we have a preventative maintenance plan instead of a reactive maintenance plan?
Yeah. And my wife and I have been fortunate. I've made a good living over the years in IT, and we've had a chance to travel. And some of what you're talking about, when you go to Europe, when you go to France, you go to Italy, there are markets, and the food is there. It's grown by local farmers. It tastes good. People are eating together in the markets, outside the markets, and the restaurants around the markets. There's a whole ecosystem there that's thriving. So it'd be nice if we could bring some of that back to the U.S. here instead of everything. It's almost like we mechanized everything since World War II. It kind of, we had to build, tanks and guns and bullets and all that stuff. And we've done the same thing to our food system, but we don't have to do that to our food system. So
we do that to our food system at our peril.
Yes. So, all right. So final is in this whole theme of cooking, whether you're doing it at home or in a community or, with your block or whatever. So what did you bring for listeners? So we're trying to get everybody to do more, at least one meal a week at home with your family. So recipe that's under $25, family of 4, few ingredients, less than 30 minutes.
That is such a tall order. So my favorite that fits this is farinata, which is an Italian chickpea flour flatbread.
Okay.
The base recipe is 1.5 cups chickpea flour and 2 cups of water and 4 tablespoons of olive oil stirred. Then you add other ingredients. I usually like to add Kalamata olives and sauteed red onions and salt and pepper, sometimes feta cheese. And
so do you make that as a dough, as a base? Is that kind
right?
Of like
it's a batter. It's a batter. Okay. So you make the batter and then you pour the batter into a screaming hot cast iron.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the oven is preheated to 500.
Mm-hmm.
So you make the batter with the chickpea flour, water, salt, pepper, and olive oil, and then you put in your fixins, your sort of pizza-like toppings,
Mm-hmm.
and then you pour that into the screaming hot cast iron on the stove that is coated with a generous amount of olive oil. You leave it there for 1 minute, turn off the stove, put the cast iron in the oven for 20 minutes. Comes out, it almost has like a frittata-like texture.
Oh, okay.
It's delicious. It's gluten-free and vegan, and also but it's not one of those things that's like, oh, it's gluten-free and vegan. It just happens to be. And it's also really inexpensive. Like a 5-pound bag of chickpea flour from Holy Land Market on 117th is like $8 or $10.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll get a bunch of farinatas out of a 5-pound bag of chickpea flour.
So that's the most unique recipe we've had so far. So that's I thought you were gonna say it was like you're making like a pizza dough and then topping it with the ingredients.
No, it's you mix it all together. It's like
that's even easier.
It's so easy. It's quick and it's delicious.
Yeah.
And it's you're getting protein, you're getting fiber. It's whole chickpea flour.
Nice. So I make all these recipes at home, and I post them on the website with pictures when your show gets posted. So everybody will have access to that and be able to see how it's made. I get to taste it myself, so I'm looking forward to that.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, Nathan.
Thank you so much.
Appreciated. Where can people find, Rust Belt Riders, Tilth on social media?
Check us out as Rust Belt Riders Composting and Tilth Soil on all social media platforms, and rustbeltriders.com and tilthsoil.com.
Fantastic. So let me close. We have our first sponsor. This is the fourth show that he sponsored here, Zimmer Real Estate Group. He's part of Keller Williams. You might ask, as I asked Bob when he said he wanted to sponsor the show, why would you have a realtor sponsor a health and longevity show? Well, Bob Zimmer is agreed to take a percentage of his commissions on sales because he's a realtor and help put them towards the new center in East Cleveland. So fantastic, and we appreciate Bob's help there. I'll have Bob's website posted on this podcast as well as my website, and I'll just say Bob describes his realty business as a local and global reach for people looking for homes to move into. So please follow us and subscribe to the show every week wherever you listen to podcasts. Please leave comments below on the website so we can continue to provide content and relevant information for living a longer, healthier life. And I want to take some of your suggestions for some follow-up podcast guests. So thank you, Nathan.
Glad to.